Hello everyone and welcome to my talk Domain-Driven Rearchitecting. First of all, let me thank you all for coming here today and let me introduce myself. My name is Matthias Eschhold and I'm a passionate software architect, trainer and enabler. Domain-driven design and software architecture are my areas of expertise. But the domain Matthias contains not only work. There exist also other areas like my family or free time as a counterpart to work. I'm the father of two girls and a husband, and luckily we share common hobbies like swimming and cycling. And you see here the wonderful TV tower of Stuttgart, and below the stadium of Stuttgarter Kickers I often visit on Saturday. It's the fifth league in Germany. It is small, not so crowded, and there is mostly a good atmosphere, and this is why I like it. And I like to travel, like the most of us. And this is my motivation to be here in my function as the travel guide for architecture modernization. As you can see, there are a lot of stations on this metro plan for architecture modernization, like rehost, migrate your system to a new infrastructure, or replace the existing system with a completely new implementation. Or our focus, re-architect the software architecture of an existing system. My topic is of particular interest to those who work on big and complex software systems that are hard to maintain and extend. Architects who ask themselves, how could I improve the situation? How could I start a re-architecture project? And how could a suitable approach be established in the development process with several teams? Get answers inspired by domain-driven design and introduce domain from legacy canvas as a supporting methodological frame. What I like to present you today is an approach to manage re-architecting intentions following the philosophy of domain-driven design. My presentation won't last more than 40 minutes, and because of the setup, I answer your questions at the end or afterwards in the Novatec booth. And I'm very sorry that the metro plan is not fully translated. But I think it's not so bad because we focused on the lane re-architect and encapsulate. And on our tour, we will meet the isolated area of anti-corruption, the separated districts of bounded context, and the connections between them based on context mapping. So what does re-architecting mean? The architecture of an application will be rethought. And encapsulate enables us to modernize in small and manageable steps. The idea of encapsulation is implicitly part of every modernization aspect we apply with bounded context and aggregates. And additionally, in the context of architecture modernization, there's often the requirement to encapsulate legacy and messy software components to handle this complexity with a clear solution strategy. A solution strategy can be, for example, the anti-corruption layer, a pattern of context mapping. But why is this all necessary? And you see it here. The first station of our metro plan is always the business criticality. And the second station is the architecture review. In other words, what is your problem and where is your problem? And the causes are like the options diverse. Dilbert knows this all too well because he suffers extremely about an unproductive development environment because he has a messy software system. Side effects, unexpected barriers, solution strategies that cannot be implemented like planned, and the need for workarounds slows down the development. And so every Monday, the product owner comes to Dilbert and asks Dilbert, are you any farther along with the software? Oh, no, I discovered an unexpected problem that set me back a week. You say the same thing every week. No one jumps off a winning horse. And you can feel it a little bit in Dilbert's answer. It contains a lot of sarcasm, and this could also mean resignation and in general a bad atmosphere. And this is a business critical aspect, and reduced productivity could also be measured in money, which then has the attention of the management. And the reason is that Dilbert struggles with high complexity, low comprehensibility, and missing flexibility in the applications architecture he daily works with. From an architectural point of view, there are often layered architectures that are driven by technical aspects like controller and services, and they often have a centralized data model, and the modernization is weak, and over time it's lost. And this leads to these negative results, especially when the system grows over years. As an architect, it's not your main responsibility to improve the mod of the others. Your responsibility is to improve the architecture. But in my experience, you can tackle both challenges with domain-driven design. When you or the project management starts a re-architecting project, then developers get new hope. They heard something about domain-driven design and the promises. They see the opportunity to learn something new and to improve the current situation. And they all suffer so much from this high coupling within and between the existing software systems. And this is also the case by domain experts. They also have problems. For example, the reduced productivity. And they also have the hope to improve such things when we think in new ways. We can generate new motivation and energy by starting to collaborate with developers and domain experts. Collaboration is one of the key success factors. With collaboration, you support communication, you can share knowledge, connect the teams, and enable them to think in new ways, which means DDD ways. This is our opportunity to involve all relevant persons and empowers them to take end-to-end responsibility for their software. And to support this process, enablers are recommended to facilitate workshops, creative work, architecture decisions, or knowledge sharing. They can be inside or outside the cross-functional teams, but this is not an issue we want to focus on today. Today, I want to give you the overview. How could you tackle such a challenge of re-architecting? And we want to start with knowledge sharing. Did I mention that we talk about the domain mobile payment? Here you see a main use case. Perform the mobile payment at point of sale of this domain. To be more specific, what you see is a so-called domain story, which describes a scenario from the perspective of an actor, like the customer. And beside the actor, there exist so-called work objects, for example, the payment transaction, and activities represented as an arrow that connects actor, work objects, and again actor. And you see it here. It is also possible that an actor is an IT system. Domain storytelling is one example for a so-called collaborative modeling technique. Event storming is another example. Both have in common that the methods are lightweighted and easy to understand for developers and domain experts. To be honest, it's not so easy to facilitate these workshops, but the attendees of the workshop, domain experts and developers could engage really fast because it's an easy method. And this is what we want to achieve. We want to bring the people together without disadvantaging anyone, especially the domain experts, by modeling from a technical perspective, for example, with UML. Such a workshop is a good start into a re-architecting project. People collaborate, maybe the first time, they have fun and they want more. And more means we want to discuss the domain model. We want to identify model boundaries. And finally, we want to find bounded context and their ubiquitous language. And these are all elements of the strategic part of domain-driven design. We decomposed our domain or problem domain into subdomains and finally bounded context. And each bounded context contains a ubiquitous language that is only valid inside this context. And the language is shared between developers and domain experts, and this helps to communicate in an efficient way because the same terms will be used in the communication, in architectural models, in user stories, and in the source code. There's no gap between. And the term payment transaction we saw in our domain story has in every of these artifacts the same semantic. A bounded context itself is a boundary around the meaning of a domain model. It's a boundary around a ubiquitous language which is only valid in this context. And we want to isolate and encapsulate different aspects of a domain on this strategical level. And it's recommended that a bounded context is a separated artifact that can be released independently. From a structural point of view, the bounded context is a modernization motivated by domain. And aggregates are elements of the tactical domain-driven design and lives inside a bounded context. Each context could contain more than one aggregates. And so we could say the aggregate is a modernization motivated by domain that drives the internal structure of a bounded context. And if we think, for example, in Java, we want to create domain modules around the aggregate. And we want to decouple the aggregates based on aggregates design rules. And one of these rules is, for example, aggregates should only reference other aggregates by their ID. And this is a concept where we can avoid this growing big object graphs, which grows to a decentralized data model. And there also exist additional design rules. And what you see here, class stereotypes. And these three class stereotypes are part of the tactical DDD. And all of this have a responsibility. The aggregate acts as a root and is described based on value objects and entity. And in this combination, we realize our domain language. And in early phases of re-architecting and also in our talk, now we know enough about aggregates if we understand that aggregates act as a root for underlying domain objects. It represents a consistency boundary where we want to achieve a valid model, and that this is possible. The stereotypes, aggregate, entity, and value object also have the responsibility to ensure the invariance, to implement business rules, to check if the created domain object is valid and react to errors. I think it's better to see this by example. Let's have a look on our customer from our domain story, and a corresponding aggregate design could look like this. The customer as the root of the domain object graph is described based on several value objects. For example, his email, his billing address, or his account. To keep it simple, we ignore today the discussion about the class stereotype entity. In practice, you have to find a way how you build up this domain-driven design expertise in the development team when you do run this re-architecting. For example, go to a training before, perform katas or dojos, or really find a balance in your approach to learn and train these things on the job. But for today, the short introduction into the strategic and tactical DDD must be enough. And I think it is enough to understand now the idea from the domain from legacy canvas. The goal of the canvas is to guide the re-architecting team step by step by applying different DDD practices which could be effectively used for architecture modernization. And the crucial foundation of all is to understand the domain, because then you understand your mission and could align the architecture perfectly to your business. The other very important source of knowledge is the current architecture and the current implementation. Here, a lot of domain knowledge is hidden behind technical names, packages, classes, and methods. And with this knowledge, we could start to rethink our architecture with the DDD principles, with the thing we heard, bounded context, aggregates, and the goal is to design a system that is loosely coupled and to reduce the existing coupling we implemented in the past. And based on this, we could also think about when we create a context map. We come to this later, what a context map is, but this is a method where we can investigate and analyze dependencies between bounded contexts, and we can tackle organizational coupling between different contexts and maybe teams. And I like to show you two different usages of the canvas, depending on the higher level goals of your re-architecture project. For example, if you want to challenge the domain, if you want to identify new potentials and rethink your domain concepts, then you spend more time in this domain discovery with collaborative modeling techniques and do this on different levels of abstraction. I say it again, collaboration is the key. And based on visualization of the domain knowledge, we could have an open-minded discussion about the domain model and bounded context. And a handful of domain stories, or for example, also event storming workshop delivers enough input to think in new ways to identify a potential domain model and discuss this. We want to make the implicit knowledge explicit. And here we see another domain stories, an example how we could do this. And here you see the scenario that a user have to register a smartphone and finally assign this to an account so that he can perform our main use case to the mobile payment. Let's have a look. The first step is the customer registers a smartphone based on his phone number in our mobile payment backend. The next step is then the mobile payment backend, which is an actor, creates a registration link. He sends this registration link via SMS to the customer. The customer confirms his identity by submitting the registration link, and the smartphone registration is successful. And then in the next step, the customer have a view on his existing accounts, or optionally, he could create a new one, and then he could finally assign an account to his smartphone, and he's now able to perform the mobile payment. So what we learn from this domain story, we gain more knowledge and we find I'm sorry, I have to drink a little bit. We get a feeling to find our domain model, to find potential model boundaries, and define finally bounded contexts. And we can transmit this knowledge to the tactical level and define so-called aggregate candidates, considering the design rules. And then, based on these aggregate candidates, we have a good scope to dive into the architecture review, to dive into the source code analysis, and explore this around this scope. And we come later back to this. Before, I want to show you another motivation for a re-architecting intention. Like in my current project, may you have the situation that there are no domain experts available, that the domain knowledge is really manifested in the existing system, and the involved persons are mainly technicians. Or you want to improve the current situation really fast and would not run this big discovery upfront. You go really fast into the source code, into the current analysis of the current architecture, and identify there the points that are necessary to extract corresponding to a short domain discovery. This means we are not investigating, we are not invest too much time in the domain discovery. We make this a little bit shorter because we are also not able to gain much information about this when the attendees are only technicians. And we need this for orientation, and this helps then us to find the elements in the source code where, for example, a domain event from the event storming workshop occurs, where we see a work object, and based on this, we could identify so-called aggregate candidates. And here you see a real-world example about a team architecture review workshop. In smaller groups, the current system will be analyzed and the relevant parts will be posted on the board. In a group discussion, we bring these things together and build up a common understanding. And based on the idea of your domain, you can effectively extract the relevant parts and knowledge from the current system, and ignoring the other things in the first step. So maybe could say that this is more a bottom-up approach, because we want to identify the aggregate candidates really fast, mainly based on the source code, and then compose this knowledge to the strategic level, where we finally want to find bounded context and the ubiquitous language. Let's have a short look how this could look like in practice. How could we investigate the source code? One approach is to look after, I already mentioned this, the aggregate candidates like the customer, analyze the dependencies starting from this point. And if we look, for example, for classes that uses the customer, then we found things with names like robot, person, account, and employee. I'm very sorry, I mean report. And we see a few bidirectional dependencies. We remember the aggregate design rules. When customer and account are potentially different aggregates, then they should only references by their ID. And it's the same with the account and the report. The next step is to understand the aggregate candidates a little bit deeper. It is not necessary to understand every detail, but we should analyze how the customer is implemented and connected to the account and the report. And this can be done if you look at the classes the customer depends on. And please notice here the check interval. And the next step, to learn how the things are related, we have to enlarge the circle of resolved, used from, and depends on dependencies. We do the same for the account. And then we notice that the class check interval that looks like a potential value object is used from the account and the customer. Why is this the case? And we want also to identify similar cases. And so, step by step, we are able to understand the big picture and have a discussion in the team about the relationships. And on the one side, they will be more clear than before. For example, we understand now that we have a report and that this is potentially another aggregate than the customer. But on the other hand, a lot of new questions will emerge. What is the result Excel controller or the person comparison service? And why are these things needed? And if you could not answer these questions, then please model a new domain story. If you have domain experts on board, ask them. And then you could discover the domain knowledge And then you see that the system will generate reports based on a check time that is assigned to an account. If the time is reached, then the report will be generated. And there's also a report that analyzes the customer behavior in comparison to a similar customer group. And based on this, we want to find product recommendations. And so we identify that the report is maybe part of another bounded context we have not on our radar at the moment. Due to the time, we do not look at this domain story in detail. I want to give an impression what a flexible setup could mean when you have questions that you could not answer from your source code analysis, and you have this facilitation skills in your re-architecting team. Then you are able to model a new domain story spontaneously and gain new insights for your re-architecting. At the end of the day, the members of the re-architecting team decide collaboratively how the new domain finally is decomposed into bounded context. And based on an open-minded discussion with these principles and patterns from DDD in mind, it will be generate a good result. And our main drivers to find bounded context are business capabilities, like we saw in our domain story. The capability to generate a report, the capability to make product recommendation. And please remember that our goal is that every bounded context has its own ubiquitous language. And this brings us to the context map to discuss relationship between bounded context candidates. And based on this, we could also tackle the organizational coupling. From the technical coupling over the strategical coupling, now we could talk about organizational coupling. When we think about relationships between bounded contexts, then we use roles called upstream and downstream. Actions of an upstream context will have an effect on the downstream team or downstream context. But actions of the downstream do not have a significant impact on the upstream. Here we have to consider that behind a bounded context can also be different teams. And if this is the case, then we have here also organizational dependencies between this bounded context and respectively the teams behind. And this roles helps us to express these relationships better, like we do it with simple architecture diagrams. But my opinion is that the strategies and solutions are not new and does not differ from the same challenges we have to solve without a domain-driven architecture approach. But domain-driven design expresses these relationships and associates pros and cons absolutely clear with the so-called context mapping patterns. Let us discuss this by example. We assume that we identified the bounded context candidate account management and customer data. Inside these contexts, we have our aggregates, account and customer. And we should solve the domain-related relationship between the account management and the customer data. At least the customer wants to know which accounts belongs to him. If we use now the account aggregate in the customer context, then we have a model flow from one to another bounded context and a model propagation into the consuming context. And as a result, this means a high coupling based on the domain model, because if the account management changed the model, this action affects then the downstream, the customer data context. If we resolve these domain-related relationships based on interfaces, then a call flow arises. Let's keep it simple. Think about calling a REST service. The downstream, as the consumer of the REST service, and the upstream is the provider of the REST service. Now, we could think about not to propagate the model after we did the call flow into our bounded context, into the customer bounded context. Maybe there's another option. And yes, there is another option. We could implement our own domain model in the customer data context. And this is an example what we mean with the definition, a boundary around the meaning of a domain model, and the account has another meaning in the customer data context than in the account management context. And on this way, by breaking the model propagation, we could reduce coupling. The coupling decides how strong the influence between these bounded contexts, respectively teams, is. We express this influence based on upstream, downstream, but we see here also there are more influence factors we have to consider that are also grow about the call flow and the model flow dependencies. We have to change something. No, we block this. We need something. No, we have no time to do this. These are organizational dependencies. We could not solve all problems with context mapping, but we make this transparent and we could work with this knowledge better when this is all implicit in our architecture hidden. And then we could discuss what are good patterns to design these dependencies. And yes, all the time I tell you, separate these things. And now our first context mapping pattern we look in detail is the shared kernel. Yes, shared kernel, this means we share parts of our domain model, for example, based on a shared database. The use case, which accounts belongs to a customer, is very easy to implement with such a shared kernel. But this may not improve the current situation because the bounded contexts are tightly coupled on the persistence level. The same idea, architecture level higher, and often a byproduct of a shared kernel based on a database, is the shared kernel based on value objects. My opinion is that we should look at the shared kernel more in sense of an anti-pattern, and we should try to avoid it. When there are really good reasons to do, for example, the complexity is so high, and you really know that it's not beneficial to separate these things, then okay, but be careful. This brings us to the separated ways pattern, the other extreme of the context mapping patterns. Here, every bounded context is independent and implements the domain concepts all by its own. If we look at our use case, can we implement the required functionality with separated ways? No, I not think so. Because the management of the account must then fully implement it in the customer data context. And the same for the product recommendations context. So we need something in between. Let's meet the open host service, the published language, and the conformist, and finally the anti-corruption layer as additional context mapping patterns. An open host service defines a universal interface that several consumers, or in other words, downstream bounded contexts, uses the same way. To decouple the downstreams from the domain model of the upstream can also introduce a so-called published language. But a published language is, in the original sense, a big thing, an industry standard with a committee in the background that defines this language. But if we follow the principle of encapsulation, then it is also a good idea to have a public representation of the domain model and a hidden original representation of the domain model inside the account management context. And based on this published language of the account, we could achieve a commitment between teams that are all relevant and involved in our re-architecting intentions. We can further reduce coupling between the context Think about model propagation. We saw the use case with the check interval for reports. This is an additional example that the product recommendation has its own meaning about the domain model account, and it have to extend it in his context boundary with the check time. And the solution is now to break the model propagation with an anti-corruption layer. This is an isolated layer with the responsibility to transform between an external model and the internal domain model, which is only valid in this downstream bounded context. And the anti-corruption layer is owned by the downstream context. And based on this concept, we establish a single point of change and are able to adapt to change faster. And this means a lower coupling. For the customer data bounded context, the team decision is an alternative pattern, the so-called conformist pattern. This means the customer data accept the domain model from the account management and propagates this without adaptation in its context boundary. So on the one side, we have a transformation, our own representation, and an isolation layer that transforms between this for lower coupling. And on the other side, we have a conformist pattern where we accept the model and we decide to propagate this model into our context. This means a higher coupling than the anti-corruption layer, but I think a lower coupling than, for example, a shared kernel. This means the conformist can be a good ratio between effort and benefit. This was domain-driven re-architecting. My goal was to give you some ideas and inspiration how you can do this. I hope this is exactly what I have achieved, and I get glad to answer any questions in the Q&A now, over the day in the Novatec booth, or contact me over other channels.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Thank you so much. We actually have a whole number of questions. I think people have a lot of questions for you. So I think you'll be probably quite busy in the Novatec booth a little later on. Let's get started with the first of them. Apart from training in DDD, what is the best first step to get buy-in from management for domain-driven re-architecting?
I think to convince the management to run a re-architecting project is to make the things, or to try to make the things or the disadvantage we currently have, like, for example, unproductive development team, visible in money when possible, and convince them by visualize what benefits can be established. For example, the teams will be more independent. We know that there are some subdomains that are really complex. We have to invest more time in it than we could recognize this in our prioritization. And so we get a better understanding of our challenges, and we could plan them better from the start. And I think these are good reasons to convince the management when they are not familiar with some technical aspects, and you could only talk about on the level of productivity, maintainability costs, and so on.
I think that's terrific advice, and I hope it answers the question for Jackie. What do you consider the difference between domain-driven design and object orientation?
What I think, what's the difference between domain-driven design and object orientation? I think you could say domain-driven design is on top. Their object orientation offers good concepts where we can apply, for example, encapsulation, where we can use in our aggregate design. And so we have a relationship between this architecture and development approach, domain-driven design, and this programming paradigm. But you don't need object orientation to implement domain-driven software. There are also the possibility to do this functional. But to be honest, I'm not experienced in this. I only use the object-oriented paradigm, mostly in Java.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is actually, it's quite a long one, so just bear with me one moment. Oh, it is scrolling quite quickly. Sorry, I'm actually going to ask another question while we fix that. What problems do you foresee if using this approach for a monolith solution with high coupling and low cohesion?
I think a problem is by a big monolith where it's maybe millions lines of code, thousands of packages or so, that the complexity is too high to run the domain re-architecting with the motivation to improve the situation fast. I think if you don't want to challenge the problem domain and you want to only re-architect the current state, and you have such a big system, then you have to analyze the things maybe firstly from a bigger scope with tooling for structural analysis, and you have to invest more in this traditional architecture review before you could put this in relationship to domain-driven concepts. And you need the knowledge of the system, and this is the reason why you have to investigate this then with more time and effort, that you can handle the complexity.
Terrific. I hope and believe that has answered the question for you, Lars. If you want to follow up on that, of course, please stop by the Novatec booth to ask Matthias after. So similarly, I think this next one might require maybe some follow-up conversation after, and good thing we're just getting started with the conference, so there's plenty of time for that. But this question is about naming in DDD. And so Sergey asks, for me, the class entity represents the domain, and it has the logic to add events, and aggregates are a type of classes that are inside of the entity, and they don't sense without the entity. And he's asking, is this correct? In different books, they're using the type aggregate root like my entity.
Yes, there are different terms. For example, aggregate root is one term you find in different sources, or also root entity, not aggregate root, so simple root entity. And I prefer aggregate because then it's a clear thing. It's not a mix with the term entity. We could separate this clearly. And in the most project context, I thrive better with this. But it's absolutely right. There are different terms and also different approaches to implement the aggregate. You could, for example, the aggregate also only have as a bracket. You could also have the aggregate as a real object which contains value objects, for example.
Terrific. Sergey, I hope that has answered the question. And again, as I said, if not, please stop by the Novatec booth after. And finally, I think we have a nice, easy one to kind of wrap up with. Can you recommend some papers or books for beginners?
Yes, I recommend the Hands-on Domain-Driven Design. This is the name of the book by Michael Blöd. And I really love Patterns and Principles of Domain-Driven Design by Nick Tune, and a co-author, but I don't know the name exactly at the moment. But you find it with Nick Tune, Patterns and Principles of Domain-Driven Design. And there's also a new book at the moment in what is really hyped in the community, Implementing Domain-Driven Design from O'Reilly, but I'm know not the name of the author at the moment. Sorry for that.
That's okay. I think we can share these links in the chat afterwards. Definitely of the first two. I'm familiar with both, so we'll share the names in the chat. Well, Matthias, I just want to say thank you for the terrific presentation this morning and for being a part of the iSAQB Software Architecture Gathering once again. And if you have any further questions for Matthias, as he mentioned, he'll be around throughout more of the conference. So please do say hello and ask your questions. Thank you again, Matthias.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining. Bye.